Namaste, yogis. Welcome to our Meet a Yogi. Today we're coming in with Petri Berndtson from Finland. He's a philosopher. Welcome, Petri.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. It's wonderful to have you back.
Yeah, it's great that you invited me straight away. It has never happened to me before that we had last talk together, and then immediately, like 10 minutes later, you put me a message and say, would you want to come back? And I said, of course.
And we'll just go ahead and extend an invite for another visit too right now, because we love to keep talking to you.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
Let me finish our introductions and then we'll get into our conversation. I also want to introduce Joe Robertson, who's our breath expert here at Sadhana. Joe, thank you for being on the call as well today.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Joe,
nice to be here.
Thank you. Joe is the person who invited Petri, so thank you for putting us together.
Nice to see you, Joe.
Same here, Petri. Glad this has worked out better than I could have imagined, So, yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, this is so good.
So, Petri Berndtson is a philosopher in Helsinki, and he is currently finishing up his PhD studies in phenomenological ontology of breathing, we're going to get into exactly what that is in this call. He was a speaker at the breath immersion on From Science to Samadhi at Kripalu, which is where Joe met him and how we've gotten connected. Today, our conversation will be about the new philosophy of love and breath. I also want to, before we get into the conversation, invite you to like this video and also subscribe to the channel if you're watching this on YouTube. It helps these videos to become more visible to people when they search in YouTube. And also, we're going to be putting a link down to the previous conversation with Petri if you're interested in hearing more about him. One other announcement before we get into our conversation is that we have a book giveaway, quite a valuable one, a book that Petri is one of the essayists in. And this book, Petri, can you give us the title of the book?
The book is here. And Joe also has a copy of the book, the one that you can win in this fantastic lottery.
I feel bad. I'm the only one who doesn't have a copy of the book.
So the title of the book is Atmospheres of Breathing. It was published in this year, April, by SUNY Press, or SUNY Press. I don't know exactly how you pronounce it.
SUNY Press.
And it's not only that I have written one of the essays in this anthology of breathing, one of the first philosophical anthologies of breathing ever to be published. I'm also the co-editor with Slovenian philosopher Lenart Škof, who is a great philosopher of breathing himself. And then we also have written the introduction to this book. And one of the things that I'm also very proud in this book is all these 16 very different kind of articles and essays on breathing from points of view to the breath that very rarely has been covered, like media of breathing or theater of breathing or feminism of breathing or stuff like this. And then what I'm also very proud of the book, when I made the index to the book, the index has 770 keywords in it. And I wanted to create this kind of index where when one starts to just read the index, it already starts to inspire your imagination and gives your thinking and your imagination kind of like a adventure into the questions of breath. Like you see one of the keywords, the next one, and so on. You start to go on like, what could this mean? How do these connect to each other? There are like cosmic breathing, the breath of God, love of breath. There is stuff like planetary lungs and all kinds of stuff. So there is interesting keywords in the index already that I was
I love
very proud of.
the amount of detail and care that you put into every aspect of your book. It shows a lot.
Yeah, I want to say still one thing about like this. The cover photo is also photographed by Slovenian philosopher and photographer Maja Pelića, and I'm very happy about this. Her photo called Tree Lungs.
That's beautiful.
Photo.
So we're going to get into that a little bit about what you've written in this book in a minute, but I want to let people know that if you came on the call or if you registered for this, that you are up for a copy of this book. It's $95 normally, so it's quite a valuable book. We also have for you a free introduction chapter, and you just go to sadhanateaching.com. Petri, anybody can get a copy of that first chapter of the book. Okay, so Petri, today we're talking about our new philosophy of love and breath, and we wanted to start out with a definition of what you're studying: phenomenological ontology of breathing. I studied philosophy, and that was not in the curriculum.
Well, this is very much true. You won't find philosophy of breath in the curriculum of university studies. It's not a branch of philosophy that academic philosophers normally see as some kind of field of philosophy or a branch of philosophy. So this book, in a certain way, for example, one of the a great philosopher, Edward S. Casey, who wrote the wonderful blurb to the back of our book, writes that this is kind of a pioneer work, this atmospheres of breathing, and I'm so proud of I'm so happy what Professor Casey wrote about our book. And so you can't find this in the departments of philosophy. I hope in the future there is a possibility to take courses on philosophy of breath or even phenomenological ontology of breathing. But you asked what is phenomenological ontology of breathing that my PhD is on.
Yes. So can we start actually with the word ontology, because that one I'm a little more familiar with, and then we'll get into the phenomenological.
Yeah. That's where I was going to start.
Okay, good.
So, ontology means science or thinking of being. Thinking of that which is the most fundamental ways of being, and where perhaps we could say that everything is fundamentally based on. What is there? What is existence? What is being? These are fundamental questions of ontology. So then, what happens with phenomenological ontology? Phenomenology is that field of philosophy, or the branch of philosophy, or style of making philosophy, way of thinking in philosophy that I come from, which is my philosophical background is in this phenomenological philosophy. And phenomenology means to get back into phenomena, to get back into that how things and the world appear as phenomena to us within our own experience, how we experience the world, how we live the world, how we are connected to the world, how our existential and this experiential field of the world opens to us in our own experience before we learn how for example, the sciences describe the world or explain the world. So in phenomenology, we try to get back, to return to that fundamental way of appearing, to that fundamental phenomenological way of how we experience the world before, for example, how the sciences explain the world. And so that then phenomenological ontology of breathing means that how we can say that how we are experiencing the questions of being, how they appear, what is being, before we would start to explain things and the world through conceptual frameworks and theories of science, or through some kind of belief systems and so on?
So I kind of studied the next step. I was a cognitive philosopher, and I studied, all of that framework that we put on from, sort of that mental framework that we put on the world that we learn, and that also may be somewhat fundamental. So it's interesting to see this like deeper level of work about, how might we experience the world prior to really shaping it. One of the things that particularly interests me about the work with breath is that as a yoga person, that I've heard so many kind of stories about why we tune into the breath, but you're the first person that has ever said maybe all of that isn't true, and that, or not to say it's not true, one way of looking at it, but that there's something more fundamental about breath. There's an elemental nature to the experience of breathing, to the experience of being in air. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, especially for people who weren't, on the previous call, to learn a little bit about, what you're exploring about the relationship of that we have to breath in a very basic level before we even conceive of those experiences.
Okay, I will tell and I will speak about that. But first I will comment on when you say that you were yourself studying philosophy kind of in the another level or next level when you were dealing with questions of cognitive science and cognitive. So cognitive science, for example, often starts with scientific point of view in the sense that they are studying what happens in our brains, for example, during the act of knowing, or in how the brain processes are connected to our knowledge and how we perceive the world and so on. So
absolutely, that is exactly what it is. So it's I don't want to get like too into this very academic rabbit hole, because I want to make it where people can hear it. But yes, it is exactly about, how could we describe how our brains work, how we think about the world. So anyway, yes, and it is a kind of a very scientific hand in hand with science and computer science.
Yeah. So why I want to comment on this, because this is also one way of telling how phenomenological perspective radically differs from this kind of cognitive scientific perspective. Because if you ask from the cognitive scientist, or at least many of them, how to study the mind, for example, or our mindful connection to the world. For example, a good example of this is like nowadays it is very common in contemplative sciences or this kind of scientific studies that study mindfulness meditation and this kind of spiritual practices, is that they study then the brains, what happens in the brains during mindfulness practice, or following your breath, or when you are doing certain kind of spiritual or contemplative practice. So this is so different from phenomenology, because phenomenologically, that is experientially, nobody has really experienced ever brains. We experience our head, we experience all kinds of stuff around us and what we feel when things, but we don't experience brains. Nobody knows that we have true experientially brains. We have thoughts, we have all kinds of meanings, but we don't have brains. That only comes from science.
What I studied was almost the exact opposite of what you studied, and that it was literally the study of the things that we cannot access phenomenologically, the processes that our brains and our minds are using, that we have that sort of black box of the brain that does things that we have no experience of. So you're like the complete opposite end, where you're saying, no, let's not look at the science. Let's not look at the neural networks. Let's not look at the heartbeat, none of which we can really experience. What do we actually experience in our sight and our taste and our touch of air? And so what do you conceive of it? Like, what are your ideas about that?
So when you do what the in phenomenological philosophy, the method is called phenomenological epoche. And epoche is a Greek word which means suspension or cessation, or putting place in abeyance, or putting aside or out of play. So in phenomenology, that you can do phenomenological philosophy, this means that you have to put aside, or kind of like put in brackets, or kind of away for a moment all the scientific knowledge and all the scientific theories that we have, and then see how the world appears after that, what we can truly experience without the scientific method. And it doesn't say that there is something wrong about science. Of course there is. Science has given us so much good things and interesting research results and so on. But if we straight away go to the sciences, we miss a lot of things, because in natural sciences, then the only interesting questions are those that we can find through the scientific method, or through the natural scientific concepts and their way of thinking. For example, all the questions of like what we truly experience, which is then the most important thing in spiritual life and meditation, is straight away put aside, because that's what then cognitive science tells about, for example, mindfulness, meditation, and what happens in our brains. For example, they say that the certain kind of brain waves change and so on, but we don't experience any of that. We experience some kind of, for example, relaxment and stuff like that.
That's what I think is so fascinating about what you're doing, how relevant it is to the work that we do in yoga, because it's funny to me, you know, it's funny now that I talk with you, although I never considered it, that we have all of these explanations that come from medicine and science about, you know, the benefits of mindfulness and of, you know, meditation, of yoga. But yoga fundamentally is a phenomenological practice. It's actually moving out of that, you know, getting out of your head. And so to me, it's like amazing to me that there is the study of what we might actually be trying to put into words, what we're actually experiencing at that level.
Exactly. This is the key point, Susanna. This is great, because yoga and meditation are phenomenological in their origin, experiential. And it's important to remember that, for example, the writer of Yoga Sutras, Patanjali, he didn't know anything about cognitive sciences. Buddha, who invented these mindfulness methods, or at least he developed them through Upanishadic tradition, he didn't know anything about cognitive science. Neither did any of the writers of Upanishads who were talking about meditation already a few thousand years ago. They didn't know anything about cognitive science. So the origin of these practices is somewhere completely different than what our science then now studies. And so this is very important. But then if we go to this, your question of like, what do I actually then do, or how do I then see the breath, is that how the breath can become a tool for meditative or spiritual practice. So many of the traditions use it as a certain kind of method or a tool or practice for spiritual development, for relaxation, or for searching God, or searching nirvana, or trying to find one's Atman, or whatever is the way that we conceptualize the goal, what we are doing, is that before we can do this, there has to be the experience of breath. Because if there wouldn't have been first some kind of experience of breath, none of these spiritual masters would have ever invented that let's use this breath. So there has to be already before it is being used as a method or as a tool for some kind of spiritual goals or some kind of other goals, for example, anxiety releasement, which is now is used, for example, in these stress releasement methods of mindfulness. So what I do in phenomenology is then I'm very interested of the meditative practices of the Eastern philosophy, because these are, as you said, phenomenological methods of using the breath and then getting deeper into the breath and expanding the breath and controlling the breath and so on. But before that, the experience of breath then itself has to have already something that made these people think or try to, that they wanted to then expand or control that breath, that there has to be something. And then in this phenomenological process of mine, I try to get back to that fundamental experience of breath and start to think it and experience it in as multidimensional ways as possible. How you begin if you start to think it as a certain kind of spacious experience, that it's how there is a respiratory space, how there is a certain kind of respiratory time, how there is certain kind of respiratory openness to the world. What is our respiratory or breathing relation with the world? How is our relation with other people, how it opens through the breath? What is then if we are all the time in connection to the world and other people, and we can be in the connection in a theoretical way, or we can be in a practical way, or in a social way, or a perceptual way, or in a religious way, or in a scientific way. All these, there are these kind of relations that we are connected with the world. Then there is also this respiratory way or this breathing way that we are in a fundamental way connected with the reality, with the world. So what is the connection between that respiratory way and, for example, our way of vision, seeing the world, or our practical? So then these relations come in picture. And is there some kind of like a level of these fundamental ways of being in the world? And one of the ways that I would say is very interesting to investigate this is to see what happens when we fall asleep. When we fall asleep, we close our eyes. So we kind of withdraw from the visual world. Then we stay in one place and we withdraw to our beds and try to be as non-moving or immobile as possible. So we withdraw from the movement towards the world. Then we also withdraw from our social life and we try to fall to sleep. We try to put all our actions of the day away from our mind, all our cultural goals and cultural enterprises and our work life and our all kinds of things that we normally value so much in our waking life. We try to put all of these aside or withdraw from them. And the only thing that we can't really withdraw, or we try not to withdraw, is from our respiratory relation with the world. And actually, one of my most important philosophers and phenomenologists for me is a French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He has these great descriptions of falling asleep. And he says that actually what we do is that we call sleep by imitating the breath of the sleeper. that it is the breath that we imitate it, and we make our breath slower and deeper than it is in our everyday life or in our waking life. And with that imitation of sleeping breath, little by little, when we go deeper and deeper into it, there happens this kind of miracle or this magical event that this imitation turns suddenly into a real sleep.
I know what you're saying, because I'm going to ask Joe to hop in here, because the work that he does with coherent breathing sounds very much like that, deliberately slowing your breath to a certain pace. It seems like that's very much like that, almost that pace of sleep, Joe. You're on mute, by the way, Joe.
You're mute, Joe.
There are so many different ways I want to enter this, but I think the best one is, with coherent breathing. I mean, I never would have thought of that, actually, but interesting you brought up coherent breathing, because, coherent breathing is simply breathing at a slow rate of 4 or 5 breaths per minute. And I think, I think it is similar to falling asleep in one specific way, which is that, this magical event of falling asleep is kind of a cessation, it's a cessation of doing anything. For sleeping to be really restorative and restful and rejuvenating, it's a certain quality of sleeping. I mean, there's good sleeping and there's really good sleeping, and the only way you get to the really, really, really good sleeping is that you have to pass through REM sleep, and you have to pass through, basically your brain has to digest everything you've taken into your brain during the day to digest your mental impressions. And after that, you come to where you don't need to digest anything anymore, and then you go into the deep sleep, delta sleep. And I don't know how else to explain it except to compare it to a gyroscope, okay? Up until that moment, the gyroscope is wobbling. There's stuff going on and you're not quite centered. There's still stuff you got to do, even if it's just dreaming. But at that magical moment, the gyroscope comes to perfection, perfect balance. And you kind of drop into the axis of the gyroscope, into the center still point. And that still point, the still point is, in yoga, is called Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Chitta Vritti Nirodha is one of the most well-known, famous kind of epithets or, phrases in all of yoga. Basically, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Chitta is mind stuff, which includes not only thoughts, but all mental phenomena, your mind stream, your feelings, all of it, chitta. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole right now, but I want to, at some point, Petri, I want to see if you agree that chitta is equivalent to qualia. But anyway, chitta vritti nirodha, it means, it basically means stopping the wobbling of your mind, which is the center axis of the gyroscope. So to bring it back to practicality, the interesting thing about phenomenological ontology of breathing is that to really get to it, you have to stop talking, I think. in order to, and let me explain what I'll tell you a quick story. One of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my life. I went to art school, okay? And I remember there was this big thing, I don't know how I got on this, but I got on this big thing about, what does it look like if you don't know what it looks, if you don't know what the name is, if you don't name it, can you see it better? And so I was drawing myself in the mirror, doing a self-portrait in the mirror for a homework assignment. And I had been drawing all night long, 6 hours, I don't know, a long time. And I was hyper-focused because I wanted it to be good or whatever. At about, I don't know, it was 2 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, I don't remember exactly. But something happened where all I can tell you is that I'm drawing, I'm looking in the mirror, I'm drawing, I'm looking in the mirror, I'm drawing, I'm looking in the mirror. All of a sudden, I looked up from my paper and I did not know what the hell I was looking at. I did not recognize myself. It's not that I didn't know my own name. It's not that I didn't know that was a human body. There was no thinking going on, period. And it was the most beautiful, mesmerizing thing I'd ever seen. It was like, see, if I say it looked like a hydra, that's post facto. In that moment, to me, that's what I think phenomenological ontology is trying to get to. And I want to hear if you agree with that or not. But, I've had other experiences like that. But, to me, and the way I take it anyway, what we're talking about is outside of language. As long as you're in language, the language is altering, or the language is, as Dan Siegel called it, a prison, a code. You perceive something, your brain encodes it into cognitive data, and you no longer have access to the actual phenomenon. So I think I should shut up now and see what, because I'm sure Petri's got a comment about this. I hope he does. Petri?
Yes. I have many ideas.
Well, we're getting a weird feedback thing happening all of a sudden.
Let me mute my...
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. So there are plenty of things that Joe said. First of all, he was talking about the second sutra of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, connected to the chitta, the mind or consciousness. And then he asked me if I think it's qualia. And then he also talked about the silence connected with the language, or the relation between language and silence. And then he's this drawing experience of where he didn't anymore know who is drawing, or what is drawing, or what is happening. So let me put this that I remember. So language question, language, silence. Then Patanjali's second sutra in connection to sleep in a certain way. And then this phenomenological experience of drawing. Let's start with let's go with the phenomenological experience of drawing first. Who is drawing? Where is Joe? Joe disappeared. Okay, so
there.
Yeah, now he's there.
He's back down.
So this reminded me straight away when you were talking about it, what Merleau-Ponty, who I already mentioned, in his last work before he died, I and Mind was his book, where he talks about, or he writes about, painters, especially Paul Klee and Cézanne and so on. And he quotes Paul Klee, or one student of Paul Klee, if I remember right, where the painter is in the forest, and after painting the forest and the trees for enough long time, there happens this magical moment, or where the painter doesn't anymore know who is looking, or who is looking at the trees, or are the trees looking at the painter, and who paints and who gets painted, and who sees and who is seen, and so on. So there comes this moment that one doesn't know anymore what is this, who is the subject, who is the object, and these relations start to switch all the time. And and Merleau-Ponty as a phenomenologist is very interested of this kind of phenomenon, and he sees that that is the state of wonder, this kind of a strange domain where which is much more fundamental or more original way of perceiving the world than that way of perceiving the world where we have already distinguished the subject and the object from each other.
One of those painters who was working with gradients, like the gradient forms and sort of fundamental forms, where it wasn't like shapes and clay. Yeah. Those sort of big squares of color.
And also I have myself sometimes this experience when I look at the mirror. If I come there comes this moment before, like, I recognize that it's me. It's very interesting, that moment where I feel like there is somebody who watches me from the mirror before I understand that it was me. And I think this is very interesting moment. And there are also these meditation practices where you look at yourself from the mirror. You don't paint, but it seems that it's very similar, is that you just watch yourself. And if you watch yourself enough long, for hours and hours and hours in a meditative state, you don't try to think you are watching, you just watch. There comes this moment when you don't, then you start to lose this kind of normal personality, which is then, of course, something that most of the meditative practices try to get into. And that then is connected with what Joe said about this Patanjali's second sutra, which then, for example, I would translate, yoga is the suspension or cessation of the movements or fluctuations of consciousness. And then, was it, what was the name of the breathing that you, Susanne, said, that falling asleep?
We're talking about coherent breathing.
Coherent breathing. So this, what happens in yoga, of course, is very similar to the falling of sleep, because also in yoga, of course, we try to withdraw from most of our movements, and we, for example, asana, which is, of course, a highly important word in yoga, which normally people understand as all these postures of different yoga postures. But it's important to remember that asana etymologically means sitting down, and to sit down, being seated from the root of as. So we could kind of say that it reminds of the word ass in Finnish, in English. So remember, just place your ass in the cushion, and then you are in asana. And so original yoga asanas were all sitting postures, and only later little by little, there started to come all these kind of other kind of
During
postures.
Patanjali's day, it was only the seated posture and meditation, because all that they were practicing at that time was meditation. And then later, around the, we first have it around that time, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, that, people were practicing only the sort of seated or on the floor postures to prep for meditation. Still, the postures were preparing for meditation, and all of them, there's no standing postures in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which I think was around the 16th century.
And especially nothing like what Ashtanga yoga brings it to this kind of acrobatic stage of doing yoga. So yeah, this is very important to remember. And in that kind of sense, yoga, this how Patanjali describes yoga as cessation or stoppage or withdrawal from the fluctuations or movements of the mind or consciousness. Here it is important to remember that in this word citta, that then is translated as consciousness or mind, this includes, for example, our perceptual relation with the world, how our mind interprets the objects and so on. So if we follow the 8 limbs or the 8 stages of yoga, from first yamas and then niyamas and then asana, then comes pranayama, then pratyahara, and then dharana, and then dhyana and samadhi. So when there is a natural process of this, that actually these 8 limbs or 8 stages of yoga, they take us or the practitioner straight to that how Patanjali describes yoga as a stoppage or cessation of the mind or the fluctuations of consciousness. Because, for example, when we sit down and we go to the asana as a sitting posture, we already stop most of this kind of consciousness towards the world in our practical life and our social life and so on. We stay in one place, like when we're falling asleep, we stay in one place in certain kind of posture of non-movement. Then comes pranayama, which is...
That seems like such an important aspect to say that, most of the time, most of these breath practices are where we're sitting and we're still. I mean, there are movement practices related to yoga, to breath, obviously moving yoga with the breath, but it actually, one of the reasons I don't do those like acrobatic yoga postures anymore is that it's very difficult to focus on breathing and do something so physically difficult. So I don't actually care to practice those things, because to me it is about linking breath to movement. So most of the things that I do are more simple, because in those I can experience my breath. It's very difficult to, obviously if you're running or doing something like that where you're just super focused on the breath, but you generally, it seems like those movements where you become still are where the breath, you can really tune into that subtle experience of breath.
Yeah. But here it's important now to make this distinction between Patanjali's yoga as yoking or uniting and connecting with some kind of is it then Brahman or the God, or Ishvara, another way of describing the God, or Purusa, or how it is, what kind of words or concepts Patanjali is using in the Yoga Sutras. And then to make a distinction between that original Patanjali Yoga Sutras and then how yoga has been understood later, because they are kind of connected, but they are different in a sense that, as you said yourself, original yoga was just sitting postures, as asana, the word itself says. So people are used to this word of yoga, but actually, as we all know, there are many different kind of yogas. And then if I keep myself now for a moment only in the Patanjali version of the Yoga Sutras, so then if I explain how these every step or every limb or every stage takes us a little bit further into that, how Patanjali already describes yoga in that second sutra of the yoga, of that yoga is cessation of the fluctuations or movements of the consciousness. So first we stop all our movement and sit, then comes the breath practices of pranayama. And this is important here, is that when pranayama is understood as control of the breath, or then it's another way of understanding what pranayama means is expansion of the breath. And then what control of the breath, it can mean, in my interpretation, it can mean two different things, two different kind of controls. Either we control the breath in a certain way, or another way, which I find very interesting way to interpret what breath control actually could mean, is that we control with the breath our whole being, all these other movements of the consciousness, that it's actually the breath that controls our whole way of being, and that would be breath control. So that, and then it would be connected to the expansion of the breath, that the breath starts to expand itself to all levels and dimensions of our existence, and that then changes completely the quality of our being.
So that gets into my next question and observation, that we talked, this topic was about love and breath. And I feel like that moment where you start to expand and you feel that expansive quality when you're focusing on your breath is that moment where you know, it's often stated as, you know, we're all love, or that experience of ourselves, our fundamental nature as loving. And then Joe also has made a comment. He said, in a nutshell, the basic fundamental conflict between matter versus consciousness first, and that we're taken out of that, you know, sense of ourselves as matter and into a sense of ourselves as consciousness. So you can correct me if I'm interpreting that wrong. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I butt in just a second? So the way I see it anyway, at the bottom of all of this, everything we're talking about, there's this ages-old conflict, disagreement, which came from, you know, it's the chicken or egg. It's the chicken or egg question. Does matter come first, and then through the process of evolution, consciousness emerges? Or, as the yogis and Easterners tend to prefer, consciousness is primordial and matter comes later. Matter emerges out of consciousness, because love, in the way that I think we're talking about it, to me, love is synonymous with consciousness itself. Love is what happens. Love is what happens when you drop into the stillness at the center of the gyroscope. Love is what happens when you have those magical moments when you don't know who's looking, you don't know what you're looking at. You know, these small, when I don't know who I am, when I forget my name, that's when I drop into love, because that's who I am before I am Joe. Does that make sense?
Okay, I think that Petri's taking some notes, and I think that, you know, this is sort of to me, the most interesting part of phenomenological philosophy, and also, you know, just really focusing on almost that like moment of transformation where, you know, like Petri said it, you've said it, there's this magical moment where we sort of withdraw our senses, where we focus, we use the focus on the breath to, you know, sort of move us to that place. And then it's like, suddenly there's that magical experience, that experience of ourselves as love. That's why we practice these things. It's why people exercise. It's why people, there's a million ways to take your focus into your breath. If you're a dancer or a runner or, you're doing weightlifting, you can focus on the breath, but on even just falling asleep. And all of them have this sort of joyful quality to them.
Yeah, that the window of the half breath, that's why I'm calling my book One Half Breath at a Time, because like when you're doing coherent breathing, 5 breaths per minute, that's about 6 seconds for an inhale and 6 seconds for an exhale. And 6 seconds, 5-6 seconds is what D.N. Stern, he wrote a book or a paper. I haven't read the whole thing, but the piece of it that I read is called The Present Moment in Everyday Life, or the experience of the present moment in everyday life. And he's the one who came up with the only time we have to actually experience is 5 or 6 seconds of now, which is a half a breath. Everything else is a story. Everything else is a story about what happened before, or a story about what happened, what might happen. But, this moment that we're talking about can only happen within this space of, and this is, this is interesting, because when that thing happened to me in the middle of the night, where I had this sort of momentary enlightenment, or, a brief window into samadhi, which is what I think it was. The reason that it's only momentary is because it scared the hell out of me. And I had to get out of there. I mean, seriously, it was the weirdest thing. I mean, I'd done acid before, LSD before, and this was without anything, which made it much more weird. Like, okay, I can't explain it because I did this drug or whatever. But the reason that it's momentary is because this 5 or 6 seconds is all there is phenomenologically. Yes, Petri?
Well, when you said this, that it scared you and you got to go get out of there, and that then you compare it with doing acid or something. Like, I have not done acid, but the thing is that, and this happened naturally. But then this brings to my mind what I have been doing lately, and it's connected with love. After what I tell now, I then want to talk about this consciousness and matter connection and what is primordial.
We have when you get ready to talk about that, we have a question and from one of our participants about that. So when you get ready to ask me about that.
Okay, so the thing is that when Joe said about this magical samadhi moment, is that what I have been practicing lately is I have been practicing with my breath the loving attitude of getting in connection with rose flowers, and that you can get into this kind of a loving relation through the breath and through the sniffing and through drawing as deep breaths and smelling the rose flower as possible. And most probably the people around there where I'm doing this, when they walk past by, they think I'm completely nuts, because I am there like a bee in the bushes of roses, and I go from flower to flower like the bees go. And then I put my nose as deeply inside the rose flower as possible. And I start to just relate with that flower so deeply, and drawing it in my nose as deep inside myself as possible. And that beautiful, sweet smell of rose flower, it totally intoxicates me. And it starts to create this kind of a total love relationship through the breath, or to breathe in a loving way, or to love in a breathing way, with that rose flower, and you get completely high, and it's completely free, and people just don't do this kind of stuff. It's available to us all everywhere. And then you do that like 10 times as deeply with one flower, then you get to the next flower like the bee flies. And when you have been doing that like 10 minutes from flower to flower, you are completely in another place. And this is one of the things that we could do with the breath, and then start to connect it with this kind of loving way of breathing, is like where we can take us if we, I said that with Merleau-Ponty's descriptions, we are calling sleep by imitating the breath of the sleeper, and then there happens this magical moment. What else could we call with our breath? Like if we try to breathe in a loving way towards the flower, can we really take ourselves into completely new ways of being by getting into this kind of lovely relationship with the flower, and then how we could connect that with being with another person, or with the sun. You are breathing with the sun, and you start to feel that you are connected with the sun when it shines on beautifully and warms you and takes care of you with its sunshine, and so on. So this is one of the ways of starting to think the connection between love and breath. How to breathe in a loving way, how to love in a how to love in a breathing way. So that they start to connect with each other. These two ways of connecting with the world, the breath and love. But then when I start to talk about the connection between consciousness and matter, did you say that there is a question now?
Yeah. So the question that we have is from our person who's coming in by the phone, Myra, and she says, yes, does matter clear consciousness or vice versa? What is the role in this question of a witness? This is a question that physics is also looking at from yet another point of view. Yes, love is the stillness when there is no more self and you can love all. So she said it's not clear. I'm going to read that again because she said, does matter create consciousness or vice versa?
Oh, does matter create consciousness?
Yeah, she had a little typo that I misread. And and then also I want to kind of start moving the conversation toward wrapping up, because we've been together for a little over 45 minutes at least. And I want to honor people's time. We have many people who have joined us now, and I just want to thank everybody who's on the call. We actually, have 5 guests here on the call today.
Okay, so this connection between matter and consciousness, this is very important question, and I try to deal this question in a phenomenological manner. And this goes well together with when I was talking about the stages of yoga, these 8 stages. And I got to pranayama, and then our discussion went to somewhere else. But the next step of there is pratyahara, which is normally understood as the withdrawal from the senses. And what that actually means is, in my interpretation of these stages of yoga, of Patanjali, is that when you go to the pranayama and you start to expand the breath or control of the breath, and you go deeper and deeper into the breath practice, and you just follow the breath or whatever you do with the breath, that automatically withdraws us from the senses, from the sense objects. Because breath itself is not a connection to the objects, the sense objects, or the material world, but it connects us with the atmosphere or the aerial world, which is not at all an object. It's not matter in that kind of sense that we can grasp it like I grasp a glass, or I grasp my shirt, or I grasp my head, or shake hands with other person, or manipulate objects. And this is what we normally understand as matter. Of course, there are very different kind of concepts of matter and consciousness. But if we deal this question, for example, when Joe was asking what is primordial, is consciousness primordial, or is matter primordial, and what emerges from what? Does matter emerge from consciousness, or does consciousness emerge from matter? And then there was also from the person who asked from one of the listeners, does the matter create consciousness, or does the consciousness create matter, which is a very similar question to what Joe was asking. So if we ask this question phenomenologically, experientially, and then we connect it with this yoga practice of these 8 stages, and then we get from pranayama to pratyahara, to withdrawal from the senses, there happens, we are actually experientially dealing with this question. We are phenomenologically dealing this question of connection between consciousness and matter. And if we understand matter as the material objects that our senses are connected with, and we understand consciousness as that relating with the world, or our way of, the consciousness has a very different kind of levels. We have theoretical consciousness, we have practical consciousness, we have social consciousness, we have perceptual consciousness. For example, seeing something is a perceiving of something. Consciousness, here important idea of consciousness, which is phenomenological idea, is that consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's impossible to just be conscious. One is always conscious of something. And here, some of the spiritual people then will say, but samadhi or enlightenment is not consciousness of something. It is consciousness when consciousness is conscious of itself. This is one of their ways of describing this kind of spiritual experience. But here it is important now to understand that when we go to the breath practice of pranayama, which is then at the same time withdrawal from the senses or the sense objects or sensual matter, we are then going to that purely conscious relation where we are not anymore conscious of the matters or conscious of objects, but our breath, through our breath, respiratory consciousness, we are becoming conscious only of that immense atmosphere, which is not anymore object consciousness. And there comes phenomenologically the key point of how to understand this relation between consciousness and matter is that when we withdraw from the senses, then this material world starts to little by little withdraw from our experience. And we start to experience the world or become conscious and aware of reality or the world, which is not limited by our material objects around us, because we get connected experientially with that atmosphere which is limitless. It is it doesn't have limits like objects have always limits. And that going deeper and deeper into that kind of expansion becomes the spiritual experience when you start to feel that comes inside you and you start to relate and exchange that kind of vast, immense atmosphere. There, that could be understood as the experience of God. It's good to remember that as Jesus describes in the Gospel of John, that God is pneuma, breath or air. So, and
wow,
then
that is incredible. Like, I have really never heard anybody really connect the dots between, you know, the practices and the consciousness, and what exactly is that we're going into. Like, that is just really beautiful how you explained it. You know, it's like we experience it, and yet it does kind of feel like magic. And, you know, it's just an amazing thing to think about, that we can actually, you know, what does that mean to pull away into consciousness, that state of pure consciousness, to experience Atman or God? You know, like, what exactly is it that we are experiencing, you know, experience without an object?
Well, that's nice to hear that it sounded good.
So I want us to start wrapping up so that we can let everybody on the call have a chance to ask you some questions in person.
We didn't much talk about love, by the way.
Well, I feel like we did in a way, but more in the sort of platonic form of love, you know, that sort of love of God, rather than you know, hospitality. And there were some things that as always, I feel like a conversation could go about 20 different directions. And what I'd like to propose as a conversation for our next time, because I do want to invite you for another visit, is that we talk specifically about human relationships and breath. There were so many moments in there where I thought that we could go in that direction, but I think this call was a little more high level. So I want us to talk specifically about human love in our next, or even, you know, with animals or plants, you know, but relationships of types and in our next call, because I think that would be an interesting, but I thought this was really a fascinating discussion of yoga philosophy and with phenomenology and the work that you're doing at the university. So as we wrap up, I just want to give you a chance to let people know how they can stay in touch with you if they're interested in following your work.
Okay. For example, you can find me in Instagram with the name Mindfulness.
Mindfulness?
Yes, this is my neologism, my new word, putting fun and mindfulness together, Mindfulness. And I want to also in the future start to have meditation mindfulness groups where we are doing mindfulness and fun together, because often mindfulness people or mindfulness practices can become quite serious, that we are doing something very spiritually serious here and trying to attain some kind of enlightenment or nirvana or whatever. So I want to put it in connection with fun and laughter. And it's important to remember that in Buddhist tradition, for example, there is this Japanese or Chinese laughing Buddha called Hotei, whose whole practice was that he came to the marketplace and started to laugh. And then people started to gather around him and started to laugh together with him, and they were finding totally different kind of relation with the world through laughter. So I want to connect laughing and mindfulness together, that we do, like, for example, mindfulness practices that you could understand them as going inside, and then the laughing practice is coming back to the world, that going inside, following, witnessing your breath and witnessing your mind, what's happening in your mind, and then suddenly burst out into the world and then laugh together. And then that's like kind of a metaphor of the out breath, and then go back like a metaphorically in breath, and then see, is your consciousness or your awareness of your own mind and of your own breath different after the laughter? And then these start to become like sequences of silence and laughter. And what would start to happen with that does it also change the quality of your consciousness, how you follow or witness? Does the witnessing of the mindfulness meditation become like a laughing witness, or this kind of a funful witness, or this kind of like, can it, like, when you, after laughter, does your awareness follow differently the breath and differently the mind? So what would be like, what kind of things that could start to happen there? And does also the quality of your laughter change after, when it's like bursts out of the meditative consciousness? So this is my idea of mindfulness. So there is mindfulness page in Instagram.
I want to let you know that Yogi Ramesh Pandey, who is one of the big laughing yoga teachers, has joined Sadhana, and he's actually done some of these media yogis with us. I just recorded him last week, and so I can put you in touch with him if you're interested. He has quite a deep practice, and he's very interesting to speak with.
That would be lovely. That would be lovely. And then there is also a mindfulness page in Facebook. You can find that. And then just Google me and find out what you find by Googling Petri Berndtson. But follow me in Instagram and follow me in Facebook, mindfulness. That's the first way to get connected.
But I just want to mention academia. Is that academia.edu? Is that correct?
Yeah. There you can find my academic work and stuff like that. But that's one of the first things that come if one Googles my name. And if one Googles Petri Berndtson, there is only one Petri Berndtson in the world. So
also on academia, their site, Lenart Škof also is there.
Yeah, definitely. So to follow also the co-editor of the book Atmospheres of Breathing, check out Lenart Škof, and you will also find nice things about philosophy of breathing.
And Joe, also, I just want to let people know that Joe's work, book, One Half Breath at a Time, as he's working on that. We have a chapter of that available, right, Joe? Didn't we put up a...
We did. Honestly, let's talk about it after to make sure.
We'll put a link up.
I'm not sure.
We'll put a link below to ways that you can reach Joe. But the main thing is, can you talk about your community on Facebook and let people know about that work?
The easiest way to find me, I suppose, is number one, Facebook page called One Breath at a Time. One breath at a time. It's not one half breath at a time. I can't change it. And the other one is, please join it's called The Breathing Community. It's a Facebook group. I think technically it's Breathing Community, Facebook group. Like that. And then I just want to mention that on Tuesday night, we're going to talk about a new thing that Suzanne and I are cooking up for you.
Yeah, so Joe is an instructional designer. I work professionally as an instructional designer. He's trained as an instructional designer, has his master's in it. And we have a project to help put the teaching into yoga teaching. We want to elevate the level of teaching in the yoga world. So we're starting on this Tuesday night. We'll be coming in live into the sadhana community for yoga teachers and enthusiasts, which I'm putting that name into the chat, and we'll have it below to the Facebook group where we're going to start talking about like what exactly is instructional design and how it can help you to be a better teacher. And we're going to be leading a series of conversations about that. You can also find in the YouTube channel lots of conversations about the Yoga Alliance. We have a lot of opinions about these so-called training standards that they have, and there's a whole playlist about the Yoga Alliance and, debating their, quote, educational standards, and why I personally don't think that they're real standards, and we talk about why, from a learning perspective, what is wrong and also what we can do to fix it. And I personally don't think that we need the Yoga Alliance to fix those things. We just need to become great teachers. So you can join me at the Sadhana community for yoga teachers and enthusiasts. And I have all the links down to join the mailing list and the mailing bot and all that stuff below this. And I'm sure everybody on the call doesn't want to hear all the links, but they are down below in the YouTube video. So,
before it gets away from me, I just want to acknowledge you, Suzanne, for making all this happen.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're awesome.
Yeah, I can say also that it's absolutely wonderful, Suzanne, that you have invented or created this this YouTube channel and your Facebook page, and how actively it seems that you are interviewing people. That is absolutely fantastic. I'm cheering and celebrating you on that.
We have such an interesting group of people that have started to become a part of sadhana. And I hope that, as we start to all connect, there seems to be such an interesting point of view emerging. Last week, I interviewed the founder of a group called Dana, and his name is Bhaskar Goswami. He's up in Canada, and he's created an app where people can it's donate their time and donate their space, and everybody teaches just out of love, and everybody gives only donations. And it's such a beautiful thing, and it actually works where people financially are able to support themselves. But it's really, I think a lot of connection between all the people who are joining, and seeing that there's another way that we can elevate yoga and create yoga that is, where we can be physically and materially in alignment with our spiritual values. So thank you so much for saying that. And thank you so much for being here. Next time we're going to do one on relationships and aerial philosophy, ontological, phenomenological philosophy of the breath.
Aerial intimacy.
Ooh, that sounds a little Cirque du Soleil there.
Also, by the way, I'm saying, I hope this is not the case, because when I speak, the picture doesn't come to me. So I hope that it has me in the photo, in the picture when I'm speaking, because now, for example, I see Joanne as big picture.
It does, and I'll explain that. So I'm going to let us wrap up. Thank you so much, Petri. Thank you.
One point. So the thing that you said about the platonic love or platonic love, it's important to make a little point here. Normally people think that platonic love is spiritual love, which doesn't have any kind of connection to carnal or bodily love. But it's important to notice that if one reads carefully Plato's Symposium and Plato's Phaedrus, one can notice that actually sexual love is very important there, and it could be even made a point that it all starts from there and then it grows into some kind of higher stages. But it's possible to interpret it in a way that in Plato's ladder of love, one never should forget the carnal love. That's like the root where then all other forms of love will be understood. And without that carnal experience, it's just imagination. It's like people can imagine and dream any kind of love, but if they don't have that bodily carnal connection first, then it's not really what Plato was talking about.
I had a really incredible Plato teacher, and I was fortunate enough to take, work with her where I was able to study one of the dialogues with her. But she told us about a different dialogue that they studied that's a little more obscure. And she said basically the whole time Socrates is just like hitting on all of the guys that he's in dialogue with. So yeah, he was definitely, they were all men, and that was what, their notion of love was definitely, that was an element of their society and his work. So anyway, I don't want to get too far down the path because we could go another hour if we start talking about Plato. But Thank you so much for being here, Petri.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was again so fantastic to talk with Joe and you.
Yes, and thank you, Joe, for making the introduction and being here to add your voice into the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
My pleasure.